I see through it now. Yes, I see through it. I have found out the secret now. The meat was too long kept, was it? Asked McNabbs quietly. No, but the meat had walked too much. How could I have forgotten that? What do you mean? Asked Tom Austin. I mean this, the guanaco is only good for eating when it is killed in a state of rest. If it has been long hunted and gone over much ground before it is captured, it is no longer eatable. I can affirm the fact by the mere taste that this animal has come a great distance, and consequently the whole herd has. You are certain of this? Asked Glenarvan. Absolutely certain. But what could have frightened the creatures so, and driven them from their haunts, when they ought to have been quietly sleeping? That's a question, my dear Glenarvan, I could not possibly answer. Take my advice, and let us go to sleep without troubling our heads about it. I say, Major, shall we go to sleep? Yes, we'll go to sleep, Paganel. Each one, thereupon, wrapped himself up in his poncho, and the fire was made up for the night. Loud snores in every tune and key soon resounded from all sides of the hut, the deep bass contribution of Paganel completing the harmony. But Glenarvan could not sleep. Secret uneasiness kept him in a continual state of wakefulness. His thoughts reverted involuntarily to those frightened animals flying in one common direction, impelled by one common terror. They could not be pursued by wild beasts, for at such an elevation there were almost none to be met with, and of hunters still fewer. What terror then could have driven them among the precipices of the Andes? Glenarvan felt a presentiment of approaching danger. But gradually he fell into a half-drowsy state, and his apprehensions were lulled. Hope took the place of fear. He saw himself on the morrow on the plains of the Andes, where the search would actually commence, and perhaps success was close at hand. He thought of Captain Grant and his two sailors, and their deliverance from cruel bondage. As these visions passed rapidly through his mind, every now and then he was roused by the crackling of the fire, or sparks flying out, or some little jet of flame would suddenly flare up and illumine the faces of his slumbering companions. Then his presentiments returned in greater strength than before, and he listened anxiously to the sounds outside the hut. At certain intervals he fancied he could hear rumbling noises in the distance, dull and threatening like the mutterings of thunder before a storm. There surely must be a storm raging down below at the foot of the mountains. He got up and went out to see. The moon was rising. The atmosphere was pure and calm, not a cloud visible either above or below. Here and there was a passing reflection from the flames of Antuco, but neither storm nor lightning, and myriads of bright stars studded the zenith. Still, the rumbling noises continued. They seemed to meet together and cross the chain of the Andes. Glenarvan returned to the casucha more uneasy than ever, questioning within himself as to the connection between these sounds and the flight of the guanacos. He looked at his watch and found the time was about 2 in the morning. As he had no certainty, however, of any immediate danger, he did not wake his companions, who were sleeping soundly after their fatigue, and after a little dozed off himself and slumbered heavily for some hours. All of a sudden a violent crash made him start to his feet. A deafening noise fell on his ear like the roar of artillery. He felt the ground giving way beneath him, and the casucha rocked to and fro and opened. He shouted to his companions, but they were already awake and tumbling pell-mell over each other. They were being rapidly dragged down a steep declivity. Day dawned and revealed a terrible scene. The form of the mountains changed in an instant. Cones were cut off. Tottering peaks disappeared as if some trap had opened at their base. Owing to a peculiar phenomenon of the Cordilleras, an enormous mass, many miles in extent, had been displaced entirely and was speeding down toward the plain. An earthquake, exclaimed Paganel. He was not mistaken. It was one of those cataclysms frequent in Chile, and in this very region where Copiapo had been twice destroyed, and Santiago 4 times laid in ruins in 14 years. This region of the globe is so underlaid with volcanic fires, and the volcanoes of recent origin are such insufficient safety valves for the subterranean vapors, that shocks are of frequent occurrence, and are called by the people tremblors. The plateau to which the 7 men were clinging, holding on by tufts of lichen, and giddy and terrified in the extreme, was rushing down the declivity with the swiftness of an express, at the rate of 50 miles an hour. Not a cry was possible, nor an attempt to get off or stop. They could not even have heard themselves speak. The internal rumblings, the crash of the avalanches, the fall of masses of granite and basalt, and the whirlwind of pulverized snow, made all communication impossible. Sometimes they went perfectly smoothly along without jolts or jerks, and sometimes, on the contrary, the plateau would reel and roll like a ship in a storm, coasting past abysses in which fragments of the mountain were falling, tearing up trees by the roots, and leveling, as if with the keen edge of an immense scythe, every projection of the declivity. How long this indescribable descent would last, no one could calculate, nor what it would end in ultimately. None of the party knew whether the rest were still alive, whether one or another were not already lying in the depths of some abyss, almost breathless with the swift motion, frozen with the cold air, which pierced them through, and blinded with the whirling snow. They gasped for breath, and became exhausted and nearly inanimate, only retaining their hold of the rocks by a powerful instinct of self-preservation. Suddenly, a tremendous shock pitched them right off and sent them rolling to the very foot of the mountain. The plateau had stopped. For some minutes no one stirred. At last one of the party picked himself up and stood on his feet, stunned by the shock but still firm on his legs. This was the major. He shook off the blinding snow and looked around him. His companions lay in a close circle like the shots from a gun that has just been discharged, piled one on top of another. The major counted them. All were there except one. That one was Robert Grant. Chapter 14, Providentially Rescued. The eastern side of the Cordilleras of the Andes consists of a succession of lengthened declivities, which slope down almost insensibly to the plain. The soil is carpeted with rich herbage and adorned with magnificent trees, among which, in great numbers, were apple trees, planted at the time of the conquest and golden with fruit. There were literally perfect forests of these. This district was, in fact, just a corner of fertile Normandy. The sudden transition from a desert to an oasis, from snowy peaks to verdant plains, from winter to summer, cannot fail to strike the traveler's eye. The ground, moreover, had recovered its immobility. The trembling had ceased, though there was little doubt the forces below the surface were carrying on their devastating work further on, for shocks of earthquake are always occurring in some part or other of the Andes. This time the shock had been one of extreme violence. The outline of the mountains was wholly altered, and the Pampas guides would have sought vainly for the accustomed landmarks. A magnificent day had dawned. The sun was just rising from his ocean bed, and his bright rays streamed already over the Argentine plains and ran across to the Atlantic. It was about 8 o'clock. Lord Glenarvan and his companions were gradually restored to animation by the major's efforts. They had been completely stunned, but had sustained no injury whatever. The descent of the Cordilleras was accomplished, and as Dame Nature had conveyed them at her own expense, they could only have praised her method of locomotion if one of their number, and that one the feeblest and youngest, the child of the party, had not been missing at the roll call. The brave boy was beloved by everybody. Paganel was particularly attached to him, and so was the major, with all his apparent coldness. As for Glenarvan, he was in absolute despair when he heard of his disappearance, and pictured to himself the child lying in some deep abyss, wildly crying for succor. "We must go and look for him, and look till we find him," he exclaimed, almost unable to keep back his tears. "We cannot leave him to his fate. Every valley and precipice and abyss must be searched through and through. I will have a rope fastened round my waist and go down myself. I insist upon it, you understand, I insist upon it. Heaven grant Robert may be still alive. If we lose the boy, how could we ever dare to meet the father? What right have we to save the captain at the cost of his son's life?" Glenarvan's companions heard him in silence. He sought to read hope in their eyes, but they did not venture to meet his gaze. At last he said, "Well, you hear what I say, but you make no response. Do you mean to tell me that you have no hope, not the slightest?" Again there was silence till McNabbs asked, "Which of you can recollect when Robert disappeared?" No one could say. "Well then," resumed the major, "you know this at any rate. Who was the child beside during our descent of the Cordilleras?" "Beside me," replied Wilson. "Very well, up to what moment did you see him beside you? Try if you can remember." "All that I can recollect is that Robert Grant was still by my side, holding fast by a tuft of lichen, less than 2 minutes before the shock which finished our descent." "Less than 2 minutes? Mind what you are saying. I dare say a minute seemed a very long time to you. Are you sure you are not making a mistake?" "I don't think I am. No, it was just about 2 minutes as I tell you." "Very well then, and was Robert on your right or left?" "On my left. I remember that his poncho brushed past my face." "And with regard to us, how were you placed?" "On the left also." "Then Robert must have disappeared on this side. said the major, turning toward the mountain and pointing toward the right. And I should judge, he added, considering the time that has elapsed, that the spot where he fell is about 2 miles up. Between that height and the ground is where we must search, dividing the different zones among us, and it is there we shall find him. Not another word was spoken. The 6 men commenced their explorations, keeping constantly to the line they had made in their descent, examining closely every fissure, and going into the very depths of the abysses, choked up though they partly were with fragments of the plateau. And more than one came out again, with garments torn to rags and feet and hands bleeding. For many long hours, these brave fellows continued their search without dreaming of taking rest. But all in vain. The child had not only met his death on the mountain, but found a grave which some enormous rock had sealed forever. About 1 o'clock, Glenarvan and his companions met again in the valley. Glenarvan was completely crushed with grief. He scarcely spoke. The only words that escaped his lips amid his sighs were, "I shall not go away, I shall not go away." No one of the party but could enter into his feeling and respect it. "Let us wait," said Paganel to the Major and Tom Austin. "We will take a little rest and recruit our strength. We need it anyway, either to prolong our search or continue our route." "Yes, and as Edward wishes it, we will rest. He has still hope, but what is it he hopes?" "Who knows?" said Tom Austin. "Poor Robert," replied Paganel, brushing away a tear. The valley was thickly wooded, and the Major had no difficulty in finding a suitable place of encampment. He chose a clump of tall carob trees, under which they arranged their few belongings. Few indeed, for all they had were sundry wraps and firearms, and a little dried meat and rice. Not far off there was a rio, which supplied them with water, though it was still somewhat muddy after the disturbance of the avalanche. Mulrady soon had a fire lighted on the grass, and a warm, refreshing beverage to offer his master. But Glenarvan refused to touch it, and lay stretched on his poncho in a state of absolute prostration. So the day passed, and night came on, calm and peaceful as the preceding had been. While his companions were lying motionless, though wide awake, Glenarvan betook himself once more to the slopes of the Cordilleras, listening intently in hope that some cry for help would fall upon his ear. He ventured far up in spite of his being alone, straining his ear with painful eagerness to catch the faintest sound, and calling aloud in an agony of despair. But he heard nothing save the beatings of his own heart, though he wandered all night on the mountain. Sometimes the Major followed him, and sometimes Paganel, ready to lend a helping hand among the slippery peaks and dangerous precipices among which he was dragged by his rash and useless imprudence. All his efforts were in vain, however, and to his repeated cries of "Robert, Robert," echo was the only response. Day dawned, and it now became a matter of necessity to go and bring back the poor lord from the distant plateau, even against his will. His despair was terrible. Who could dare to speak of quitting this fatal valley? Yet provisions were done, and Argentine guides and horses were not far off to lead them to the Pampas. To go back would be more difficult than to go forward. Besides, the Atlantic Ocean was the appointed meeting place with the Duncan. These were strong reasons against any long delay. Indeed, it was best for all parties to continue the route as soon as possible. McNabbs undertook the task of rousing Lord Glenarvan from his grief. For a long time his cousin seemed not to hear him. At last he shook his head and said, almost inaudibly, "Did you say we must start?" "Yes, we must start." "Wait 1 hour longer." "Yes, we'll wait another," replied the Major. The hour slipped away, and again Glenarvan begged for longer grace. To hear his imploring tones, one might have thought him a criminal begging a respite. So the day passed on till it was almost noon. McNabbs hesitated now no longer, but, acting on the advice of the rest, told his cousin that start they must, for all their lives depended on prompt action. "Yes, yes," replied Glenarvan, "let us start, let us start." But he spoke without looking at McNabbs. His gaze was fixed intently on a certain dark speck in the heavens. Suddenly he exclaimed, extending his arm and keeping it motionless as if petrified, "There's there, look, look." All eyes turned immediately in the direction indicated so imperiously. The dark speck was increasing visibly. It was evidently some bird hovering above them. "A condor," said Paganel. "Yes, a condor," replied Glenarvan. "Who knows, he is coming down, he is gradually getting lower, let us wait." Paganel was not mistaken, it was assuredly a condor. This magnificent bird is the king of the southern Andes, and was formerly worshipped by the Incas. It attains an extraordinary development in those regions. Its strength is prodigious. It has frequently driven oxen over the edge of precipices down into the depths of abysses. It seizes sheep and kids and young calves, browsing on the plains, and carries them off to inaccessible heights. It hovers in the air far beyond the utmost limits of human sight, and its powers of vision are so great that it can discern the smallest objects on the earth beneath. What had this condor discovered then? Could it be the corpse of Robert Grant? Who knows? Repeated Glenarvan, keeping his eye immovably fixed on the bird. The enormous creature was fast approaching, sometimes hovering for a while with outspread wings, and sometimes falling with the swiftness of inert bodies in space. Presently he began to wheel round in wide circles. They could see him distinctly. He measured more than 15 feet, and his powerful wings bore him along with scarcely the slightest effort, for it is the prerogative of large birds to fly with calm majesty, while insects have to beat their wings 1,000 times a second. The Major and Wilson had seized their carbines, but Glenarvan stopped them by a gesture. The condor was encircling in his flight a sort of inaccessible plateau about a quarter of a mile up the side of the mountain. He wheeled round and round with dazzling rapidity, opening and shutting his formidable claws, and shaking his cartilaginous carbuncle, or comb. "It is there," exclaimed Glenarvan. A sudden thought flashed across his mind, and with a terrible cry he called out, "Fire! Fire! Oh, suppose Robert were still alive, that bird!" But it was too late. The condor had dropped out of sight behind the crags. Only a second passed, a second that seemed an age, and the enormous bird reappeared, carrying a heavy load and flying at a slow rate. A cry of horror rose on all sides. It was a human body the condor had in his claws, dangling in the air, and apparently lifeless. It was Robert Grant. The bird had seized him by his clothes and had him hanging already at least 150 feet in the air. He had caught sight of the travelers and was flapping his wings violently, endeavoring to escape with his heavy prey. Oh, would that Robert were dashed to pieces against the rocks, rather than be a... He did not finish his sentence, but seizing Wilson's carbine, took aim at the condor. His arm was too trembling, however, to keep the weapon steady. "Let me do it," said the Major. And with a calm eye and sure hands and motionless body, he aimed at the bird, now 300 feet above him in the air. But before he had pulled the trigger, the report of a gun resounded from the bottom of the valley. A white smoke rose from between two masses of basalt, and the condor, shot in the head, gradually turned over and began to fall, supported by his great wings spread out like a parachute. He had not let go his prey, but gently sank down with it on the ground, about 10 paces from the stream. We've got him," shouted Glenarvan, and without waiting to see where the shot so providentially came from, he rushed toward the condor, followed by his companions. When they reached the spot, the bird was dead, and the body of Robert was quite concealed beneath his mighty wings. Glenarvan flung himself on the corpse, and dragging it from the condor's grasp, placed it flat on the grass, and knelt down and put his ear to the heart. But a wilder cry of joy never broke from human lips, than Glenarvan uttered the next moment, as he started to his feet and exclaimed, "He is alive, he is still alive." The boy's clothes were stripped off in an instant, and his face bathed with cold water. He moved slightly, opened his eyes, looked round and murmured, "Oh, my lord, is it you?" He said, "My father." Glenarvan could not reply. He was speechless with emotion, and kneeling down by the side of the child so miraculously saved, burst into tears. Chapter 15, Thalcave. Robert had no sooner escaped one terrible danger than he ran the risk of another scarcely less formidable. He was almost torn to pieces by his friends, for the brave fellows were so overjoyed at the sight of him, that in spite of his weak state, none of them would be satisfied without giving him a hug. However, it seemed as if good rough hugging did not hurt sick people. At any rate, it did not hurt Robert, but quite the contrary. But the first joy of deliverance over, the next thought was who was the deliverer? Of course it was the Major who suggested looking for him, and he was not far off, for about 50 paces from the Rio, a man of very tall stature was seen standing motionless on the lowest crags at the foot of the mountain. A long gun was lying at his feet. He had broad shoulders and long hair bound together with leather thongs. He was over 6 feet in height. His bronzed face was red between the eyes and mouth, black by the lower eyelids and white on the forehead. He wore the costume of the Patagonians on the frontiers, consisting of a splendid cloak, ornamented with scarlet arabesques, made of the skins of the guanaco, sewed together with ostrich tendons, and with the silky wool turned up on the edge. Under this mantle was a garment of fox skin, fastened round the waist and coming down to a point in front. A little bag hung from his belt, containing colors for painting his face. His boots were pieces of ox hide, fastened round the ankles by straps across. This Patagonian had a splendid face, indicating real intelligence, notwithstanding the medley of colors by which it was disfigured. His waiting attitude was full of dignity. Indeed, to see him standing grave and motionless on his pedestal of rocks, one might have taken him for a statue of sang-froid. As soon as the major perceived him, he pointed him out to Glenarvan, who ran toward him immediately. The Patagonian came 2 steps forward to meet him, and Glenarvan caught hold of his hand and pressed it in his own. It was impossible to mistake the meaning of the action, for the noble face of the Scotch lord so beamed with gratitude that no words were needed. The stranger bowed slightly in return, and said a few words that neither Glenarvan nor the major could understand. The Patagonian surveyed them attentively for a few minutes, and spoke again in another language. But this second idiom was no more intelligible than the first. Certain words, however, caught Glenarvan's ear as sounding like Spanish, a few sentences of which he could speak. "Espanol?" he asked. The Patagonian nodded in reply, a movement of the head which has an affirmative significance among all nations. "That's good," said the major. "Our friend Paganel will be the very man for him. It is lucky for us that he took it into his head to learn Spanish." Paganel was called forthwith. He came at once and saluted the stranger with all the grace of a Frenchman, but his compliments were lost on the Patagonian, for he did not understand a single syllable. However, on being told how things stood, he began in Spanish, and opening his mouth as wide as he could, the better to articulate, said, "Vos sois un hombre de bem, you are a brave man." The native listened, but made no reply. "He doesn't understand," said the geographer. "Perhaps you haven't the right accent," suggested the major. "That's just it, confound the accent." Once more Paganel repeated his compliment, but with no better success. "I'll change the phrase," he said, and in slow, deliberate tones he went on, "Sam duvida Patago, a Patagonian undoubtedly." No response still. "Dizem," said Paganel, "answer me." But no answer came. "Vos comprendes? Do you understand?" shouted Paganel at the very top of his voice as if he would burst his throat. Evidently the Indian did not understand, for he replied in Spanish. "No comprendo, I do not understand." It was Paganel's turn now to be amazed. He pushed his spectacles right down over his nose, as if greatly irritated, and said, "I'll be hanged if I can make out one word of his infernal patois. It is Araucanian, that's certain." "Not a bit of it," said Glenarvan. "It was Spanish he spoke." And addressing the Patagonian, he repeated the word, "Espanol," Spanish. "Si, yes, yes," replied the Indian. Paganel's surprise became absolute stupefaction. The major and his cousin exchanged sly glances, and McNabbs said, mischievously, with a look of fun on his face, "Ah, my worthy friend, is this another of your misadventures? You seem to have quite a monopoly of them." "What?" said Paganel, pricking up his ear. "Yes, it's clear enough the man speaks Spanish." "He?" "Yes, he certainly speaks Spanish. Perhaps it is some other language you have been studying all this time instead of." But Paganel would not allow him to proceed. He shrugged his shoulders and said stiffly, "You go a little too far, Major." "Well, how is it that you don't understand him then?" "Why, of course, because the man speaks badly," replied the learned geographer, getting impatient. "He speaks badly, that is to say, because you can't understand him," returned the major coolly. Come, McNabbs," put in Glenarvan, "your supposition is quite inadmissible. However distrait our friend Paganel is, it is hardly likely he would study one language for another." "Well, Edward, or rather you, my good Paganel, explain it then." "I explain nothing, I give proof. Here is the book I use daily to practice myself in the difficulties of the Spanish language. Examine it for yourself, Major," he said, handing him a volume in a very ragged condition, which he had brought up, after a long rummage, from the depths of one of his numerous pockets. "Now you can see whether I am imposing on you," he continued, indignantly. "And what's the name of this book?" asked the major as he took it from his hand. The Lusíades, an admirable epic which... The Lusíades, exclaimed Glenarvan. Yes, my friend, the Lusíades of the great Camões, neither more nor less. Camões, repeated Glenarvan. But Paganel, my unfortunate fellow, Camões was a Portuguese. It is Portuguese you have been learning for the last 6 weeks. Camões, Lusíades, Portuguese. Paganel could not say more. He looked vexed, while his companions, who had all gathered round, broke out in a furious burst of laughter. The Indian never moved a muscle of his face. He quietly awaited the explanation of this incomprehensible mirth. Fool idiot that I am, at last uttered Paganel. Is it really a fact? You are not joking with me? It is what I have actually been doing? Why, it is a second confusion of tongues like Babel. Ah me, alackaday, my friends, what is to become of me? To start for India and arrive at Chile, to learn Spanish and talk Portuguese. Why, if I go on like this, someday I shall be throwing myself out of the window instead of my cigar. To hear Paganel bemoan his misadventures and see his comical discomfiture would have upset anyone's gravity. Besides, he set the example himself and said, Laugh away, my friends, laugh as loud as you like. You can't laugh at me half as much as I laugh at myself. But I say, said the major, after a minute, this doesn't alter the fact that we have no interpreter. Oh, don't distress yourself about that, replied Paganel. Portuguese and Spanish are so much alike that I made a mistake, but this very resemblance will be a great help toward rectifying it. In a very short time, I shall be able to thank the Patagonian in the language he speaks so well. Paganel was right. He soon managed to exchange a few words with the stranger, and found out even that his name was Thalcave, a word that signified in Araucanian, the Thunderer. This surname had, no doubt, come from his skill in handling firearms. But what rejoiced Glenarvan most was to learn that he was a guide by occupation, and, moreover, a guide across the Pampas. To his mind, the meeting with him was so providential that he could not doubt now of the success of their enterprise. The deliverance of Captain Grant seemed an accomplished fact. When the party went back to Robert, the boy held out his arms to the Patagonian, who silently laid his hand on his head, and proceeded to examine him with the greatest care, gently feeling each of his aching limbs. Then he went down to the Rio, and gathered a few handfuls of wild celery, which grew on the banks, with which he rubbed the child's body all over. He handled him with the most exquisite delicacy, and his treatment so revived the lad's strength that it was soon evident that a few hours' rest would set him all right. It was accordingly decided that they should encamp for the rest of the day and the ensuing night. Two grave questions, moreover, had to be settled: where to get food and means of transport. Provisions and mules were both lacking. Happily, they had Thalcave, however, a practiced guide and one of the most intelligent of his class. He undertook to find all that was needed, and offered to take him to a tolderia of Indians, not further than 4 miles off at most, where he could get supplies of all he wanted. This proposition was partly made by gestures, and partly by a few Spanish words which Paganel managed to make out. His offer was accepted, and Glenarvan and his learned friend started off with him at once. They walked at a good pace for an hour and a half, and had to make great strides to keep up with the giant Thalcave. The road lay through a beautiful fertile region, abounding in rich pasturages, where 100,000 cattle might have fed comfortably. Large ponds, connected by an inextricable labyrinth of rios, amply watered these plains and produced their greenness. Swans with black heads were disporting in the water, disputing possession with the numerous intruders which gamboled over the llanos. The feathered tribes were of most brilliant plumage, and of marvelous variety and deafening noise. The isacus, a graceful sort of dove with gray feathers streaked with white, and the yellow cardinals were flitting about in the trees like moving flowers, while overhead pigeons, sparrows, chingalos, bulgaros, and mongitas were flying swiftly along, rending the air with their piercing cries. Paganel's admiration increased with every step, and he had nearly exhausted his vocabulary of adjectives by his loud exclamations, to the astonishment of the Patagonian, to whom the birds and the swans and the prairies were everyday things. The learned geographer was so lost in delight that he seemed hardly to have started before they came in sight of the Indian camp, or tolderia, situated in the heart of a valley. About 30 nomadic Indians were living there in rude cabins made of branches, pasturing immense herds of milch cows, sheep, oxen, and horses. They went from one prairie to another, always finding a well-spread table for their four-footed guests. These nomads were a hybrid type of Araukans, Pehuenches, and Aucas. They were Ando-Peruvians of an olive tint, of medium stature and massive form, with a low forehead, almost circular face, thin lips, high cheekbones, effeminate features, and cold expression. As a whole, they are about the least interesting of the Indians. However, it was their herds Glenarvan wanted, not themselves. As long as he could get beef and horses, he cared for nothing else. Thalcave did the bargaining. It did not take long. In exchange for 7 ready-saddled horses of the Argentine breed, 100 pounds of charqui, or dried meat, several measures of rice, and leather bottles for water, the Indians agreed to take 20 ounces of gold as they could not get wine or rum, which they would have preferred, though they were perfectly acquainted with the value of gold. Glenarvan wished to purchase an 8th horse for the Patagonian, but he gave him to understand that it would be useless. They got back to the camp in less than half an hour and were hailed with acclamations by the whole party, or rather the provisions and horses were. They were all hungry and ate heartily of the welcome viands. Robert took a little food with the rest. He was fast recovering strength. The close of the day was spent in complete repose and pleasant talk about the dear absent ones. Paganel never quitted the Indian's side. It was not that he was so glad to see a real Patagonian, by whom he looked a perfect pygmy, a Patagonian who might have almost rivaled the Emperor Maxima, and that Congo Negro seen by the learned Van der Broek, both 8 feet high. But he caught up Spanish phrases from the Indian, and studied the language without a book this time, gesticulating at a great rate all the grand, sonorous words that fell on his ear. "If I don't catch the accent," he said to the major, "it won't be my fault, but who would have said to me that it was a Patagonian who would teach me Spanish one day?" Chapter 16. The News of the Lost Captain. Next day, the 22nd of October, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Thalcave gave the signal for departure. Between the 22nd and degrees, the Argentine soil slopes eastward, and all the travelers had to do was to follow the slope right down to the sea. Glenarvan had supposed Thalcave's refusal of a horse was that he preferred walking, as some guides do, but he was mistaken, for just as they were ready, the Patagonian gave a peculiar whistle, and immediately a magnificent steed of the pure Argentine breed came bounding out of a grove close by, at his master's call. Both in form and color, the animal was of perfect beauty. The major, who was a thorough judge of all the good points of a horse, was loud in admiration of this sample of the Pampas breed, and considered that, in many respects, he greatly resembled an English hunter. This splendid creature was called Thayuca, a word in Patagonia which means bird, and he well deserved the name. Thalcave was a consummate horseman, and to see him on his prancing steed was a sight worth looking at. The saddle was adapted to the 2 hunting weapons in common use on the Argentine plains, the boluses and the lazo. The boluses consists of 3 balls fastened together by a strap of leather, attached to the front of the recado. The Indians fling them often at the distance of 100 feet from the animal or enemy of which they are in pursuit, and with such precision that they catch round their legs and throw them down in an instant. It is a formidable weapon in their hands, and one they handle with surprising skill. The lazo is always retained in the hand. It is simply a rope, 30 feet long, made of tightly twisted leather, with a slip knot at the end which passes through an iron ring. This noose was thrown by the right hand, while the left keeps fast hold of the rope, the other end of which is fastened to the saddle. A long carbine in the shoulder belt completed the accoutrements of the Patagonian. He took his place at the head of the party, quite unconscious of the admiration he was exciting, and they set off, going alternately at a gallop and walking pace, for the trot seemed altogether unknown to them. Robert proved to be a bold rider, and completely reassured Glenarvan as to his ability to keep his seat. The Pampas commenced at the very foot of the Cordilleras. They may be divided into 3 parts. The first extends from the chain of the Andes, and stretches over an extent of 250 miles covered with stunted trees and bushes. The second miles is clothed with magnificent herbage, and stops about 180 miles from Buenos Aires. From this point to the sea, the foot of the traveler treads over immense prairies of lucerne and thistles, which constitute the 3rd division of the Pampas. On issuing from the gorges of the Cordilleras, Glenarvan and his band came first to plains of sand, called medanos, lying in ridges like waves of the sea, and so extremely fine that the least breath of wind agitated the light particles, and sent them flying in clouds, which rose and fell like waterspouts. It was a spectacle which caused both pleasure and pain, for nothing could be more curious than to see the said waterspouts wandering over the plain, coming in contact and mingling with each other, and falling and rising in wild confusion. But on the other hand, nothing could be more disagreeable than the dust which was thrown off by these innumerable medanos, which was so impalpable that close one's eyes as they might, it found its way through the lids. This phenomenon lasted the greater part of the day. The travelers made good progress, however, and about 4 o'clock the Cordilleras lay full 40 miles behind them, the dark outlines being already almost lost in the evening mists. They were all somewhat fatigued with the journey, and glad enough to halt for the night on the banks of the Nuquam, called Raymide, or Camo by certain geographers, a troubled, turbulent rapid flowing between high red banks. No incident of any importance occurred that night or the following day. They rode well and fast, finding the ground firm and the temperature bearable. Toward noon, however, the sun's rays were extremely scorching, and when evening came, a bar of clouds streaked the southwest horizon, a sure sign of a change in the weather. The Patagonian pointed it out to the geographer, who replied, "Yes, I know," and turning to his companions, added, "See, a change of weather is coming. We are going to have a taste of Pampero." And he went on to explain that this Pampero is very common in the Argentine plains. It is an extremely dry wind which blows from the southwest. Thalcave was not mistaken, for the Pampero blew violently all night and was sufficiently trying to poor fellows only sheltered by their ponchos. The horses lay down on the ground, and the men stretched themselves beside them in a close group. Glenarvan was afraid they would be delayed by the continuance of the hurricane, but Paganel was able to reassure him on that score, after consulting his barometer. The Pampero generally brings a tempest which lasts 3 days and may be always foretold by the depression of the mercury, he said. But when the barometer rises, on the contrary, which is the case now, all we need expect is a few violent blasts. So you can make your mind easy, my good friend. By sunrise the sky will be quite clear again. You talk like a book, Paganel, replied Glenarvan. And I am one, and what's more, you are welcome to turn over my leaves whenever you like. The book was right. At 1 o'clock the wind suddenly lulled, and the weary men fell asleep and woke at daybreak, refreshed and invigorated. It was the 20th of October, and the 10th day since they had left Talcahuano. They were still 90 miles from the point where the Rio Colorado crosses the 37th parallel, that is to say, about 2 days' journey. Glenarvan kept a sharp lookout for the appearance of any Indians, intending to question them, through Thalcave, about Captain Grant, as Paganel could not speak to him well enough for this. But the track they were following was one little frequented by the natives, for the ordinary routes across the Pampas lie further north. If by chance some nomadic horseman came in sight far away, he was off again like a dart, not caring to enter into conversation with strangers. To a solitary individual, a little troop of 8 men, all mounted and well armed, wore a suspicious aspect, so that any intercourse either with honest men or even banditti was almost impossible. Glenarvan was regretting this exceedingly, when he unexpectedly met with a singular justification of his rendering of the eventful document. In pursuing the course the travelers had laid down for themselves, they had several times crossed the routes over the plains in common use, but had struck into none of them. Hitherto Thalcave had made no remark about this. He understood quite well, however, that they were not bound for any particular town, or village, or settlement. Every morning they set out in a straight line toward the rising sun, and went on without the least deviation. Moreover, it must have struck Thalcave that instead of being the guide he was guided, yet with true Indian reserve, he maintained absolute silence. But on reaching a particular point, he checked his horse suddenly, and said to Paganel, "The Carmen route." "Yes, my good Patagonian," replied Paganel in his best Spanish, "the route from Carmen to Mendoza." "We are not going to take it." "No," replied Paganel. "Where are we going then?" "Always to the east." "That's going nowhere." "Who knows?" Thalcave was silent, and gazed at the geographer with an air of profound surprise. He had no suspicion that Paganel was joking, for an Indian is always grave. "You are not going to Carmen, then?" he added after a moment's pause. "No." "Nor to Mendoza?" "No, nor to Mendoza." Just then Glenarvan came up to ask the reason of the stoppage, and what he and Thalcave were discussing. He wanted to know whether we were going to Carmen or Mendoza, and was very much surprised at my negative reply to both questions. Well, certainly, it must seem strange to him. "I think so. He says we are going nowhere." "Well, Paganel, I wonder if it is possible to make him understand the object of our expedition, and what our motive is for always going east." That would be a difficult matter, for an Indian knows nothing about degrees, and the finding of the document would appear to him a mere fantastic story. Is it the story he would not understand, or the storyteller? Said McNabbs quietly. Ah, McNabbs, I see you have small faith in my Spanish yet. Well, try it, my good friend. So I will. And turning round to the Patagonian, he began his narrative, breaking down frequently for the want of a word, and the difficulty of making certain details intelligible to a half-civilized Indian. It was quite a sight to see the learned geographer. He gesticulated and articulated, and so worked himself up over it, that the big drops of sweat fell in a cascade down his forehead onto his chest. When his tongue failed, his arms were called to aid. Paganel got down on the ground and traced a geographical map on the sand, showing where the lines of latitude and longitude cross and where the two oceans were, along which the Carmen route led. Thalcave looked on composedly, without giving any indication of comprehending or not comprehending. The lesson had lasted half an hour, when the geographer left off, wiped his streaming face, and waited for the Patagonian to speak. "Does he understand?" said Glenarvan. "That remains to be seen, but if he doesn't I give it up," replied Paganel. Thalcave neither stirred nor spoke. His eyes remained fixed on the lines drawn on the sand, now becoming fast effaced by the wind. "Well," said Paganel to him at length. The Patagonian seemed not to hear. Paganel fancied he could detect an ironical smile already on the lips of the Major, and determined to carry the day, was about to recommence his geographical illustrations, when the Indian stopped him by a gesture and said, "You are in search of a prisoner." "Yes," replied Paganel. "And just on this line between the setting and rising sun?" added Thalcave, speaking in Indian fashion of the route from west to east. "Yes, yes, that's it." "And it's your God," continued the guide, "that has sent you the secret of this prisoner on the waves." "God himself." "His will be accomplished then," replied the native almost solemnly. "We will march east and if it needs be to the sun." Paganel, triumphing in his pupil, immediately translated his replies to his companions, and exclaimed, "What an intelligent race! All my explanations would have been lost on 19 in every 20 of the peasants in my own country." Glenarvan requested him to ask the Patagonian if he had heard of any foreigners who had fallen into the hands of the Indians of the Pampas. Paganel did so and waited an answer. "Perhaps I have." The reply was no sooner translated than the Patagonian found himself surrounded by the 7 men questioning him with eager glances. Paganel was so excited, he could hardly find words, and he gazed at the grave Indian as if he could read the reply on his lips. Each word spoken by Thalcave was instantly translated, so that the whole party seemed to hear him speak in their mother tongue. "And what about the prisoner?" asked Paganel. "He was a foreigner." "You have seen him?" "No, but I have heard the Indians speak of him. He is brave, he has the heart of a bull." "The heart of a bull," said Paganel. "Ah, this magnificent Patagonian language. You understand him, my friends, he means a courageous man." "My father," exclaimed Robert Grant, and turning to Paganel, he asked what the Spanish was for. "Is it my father?" "Es mio padre," replied the geographer. Immediately taking Thalcave's hands in his own, the boy said in a soft tone, "Es mio padre." "Suo padre," replied the Patagonian, his face lighting up. He took the child in his arms, lifted him up on his horse, and gazed at him with peculiar sympathy. His intelligent face was full of quiet feeling. But Paganel had not completed his interrogations. This prisoner, who was he? What was he doing? When had Thalcave heard of him? All these questions poured upon him at once. He had not long to wait for an answer, and learned that the European was a slave in one of the tribes that roamed the country between the Colorado and the Rio Negro. But where was the last place he was in? With the cacique Cafokura. In the line we have been following. Yes. And who is this cacique? The chief of the Poyaches Indians, a man with 2 tongues and 2 hearts. That's to say false in speech and false in action, said Paganel, after he had translated this beautiful figure of the Patagonian language. And can we deliver our friend? He added. You may if he is still in the hands of the Indians. And when did you last hear of him? A long while ago. The sun has brought 2 summers since then to the Pampas. The joy of Glenarvan cannot be described. This reply agreed perfectly with the date of the document, but one question still remained for him to put to Thalcave. You spoke of a prisoner, he said, but were there not 3? I don't know, said Thalcave. And you know nothing of his present situation. And nothing. This ended the conversation. It was quite possible that the 3 men had become separated long ago, but still this much was certain, that the Indians had spoken of a European that was in their power, and the date of the captivity, and even the descriptive phrase about the captive, evidently pointed to Harry Grant. Chapter 17. A Serious Necessity.